Hello, everybody. Today, I'm Anton. I'm going to talk about modular monoliths, as the slide says. So yeah, I'm kind of want to go through, like, share my experience, and then we're going to get to the end and I want to hear like what you guys think and if you have something to add, because yeah, it's still in the process of I'm deciding, researching what's the best way. So question to the audience, who knows what is Rails engine? All right, we got like 30%. Yeah. So Rails engine is like it's a miniature application. So in fact, Rails application is a Rails engine. It just has more stuff on it, but ultimately Rails engine is like it's a capsule of application. So, and there is a good documentation on ruby-on-rails.org that just talks all about it. So that's like will be your best resource. But ultimately, for the sake of the discussion, think of that as just like it's a little application, which can be within other Rails application, right? So it's like it's one application within other application. Yeah, does that make sense? Because ultimately that's what it is. And because yeah, like Rails, like I mentioned, like Rails itself is Rails engine, right? So that's why it's just like stacks as mentioned before. So, and just to kind of give you the idea, because there's like whole spectrum of all the topics that we can talk about, and just gonna give you like some perspective. So like on the left you have the standard Rails architecture, like standard Rails applications, and on the far right you have like microservices, right? And generally people kind of see one or another, while in reality there is like it's like a spectrum, right? There's a scale, and just to kind of give you this, like little by little, there's like we can like gonna talk about like what's in between them, right? How you can kind of leverage both benefits from both sides, but without kind of going full 100% on microservices. Yeah, so this slide is so yeah, like pretty much like just give you an idea, like if you see these lean engines, so we're gonna talk about like one step to the right from standard Rails applications, right? So it's just kind of like, hey, we're just gonna move closer, but not too far, right? So just to kind of understand like what we are talking about. So yeah, lean engines. So to kind of get started, and there are like a lot of documentations, but there is like this simple thing how to just get started with Rails engines. You can just literally do it in 1 minute. All you need to do is just like two changes, right? So first of all, you just need to create a file somewhere. I put it into this apps, the maplib engine file. You'll just literally put this empty cluster. And when you're loading your application, config application.rb, you just load that file. So that's it. That's all you need to do to get your blank Rails engine started. And this is you can reference that approach from RubyConf Australia this year, I think. Julian did like great talk about like pretty much exactly that, and that previous slide of architectures is taken from his presentation as well. So have a look. He goes into detail like yeah, how to set up. So yeah, that's pretty much inspired from his work. So, and this is pretty much my approach is like based on that. Like, so gonna quickly, yeah, just gonna talk and just kind of demo what I have. And so pretty much, yeah, like what we are talking about is more like lean engines or modular monolith, right? So you have like one application, but within application you have tiny small applications, right? So it's like microservices, but it's still one application. So ultimately, we're not going to have anything in our app directory. We're going to have everything inside the apps directory, right? Like it's a plural. Then it will be like a core engine. We're still going to use single routes file. We're still going to use the same single migration list. And specs will be per engine, right? So just to demonstrate, so I have this as application that's in production. So as you can see, normally you would have just like app, and then you have your models and stuff. Like I don't have any of them, but I have this apps folder, and ultimately each folder is own like Rails application. And if you open as an admin app, you have exactly the same structure, config, lib, and all of the same. Like you can see, like it's again Rails application within Rails application. And that's pretty much you. And the core app is like the foundation, like that's where all of the, if you open up, that's where all of the application kind of root classes live. Yeah, so that's kind of the basic setup, and you can see like the specs all in here. So, but ultimately we have Rails application which doesn't have any code, but it has list of this Rails application inside it. Yep, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Cool, awesome. So yeah, that's pretty much like the approach that I would call like this lean engines, right? Like it's very lightweight. And just to, you can see this lib folder, and this is that engine, how to set up. So when it's all based on convention, when Rails loads this file, it just knows what to do with the rest. You just point to this file under the lib engine.ab, and it just works magically. Yeah.
So you said the specs are separate.
Yep.
Does that mean, do the specs boot just the engine under test, or does the specs boot the entire application?
Currently, I've set up just boot everything, but you can actually pick and choose what you boot. If you set up all the dependencies, yeah, and that's another like advantage of here, but we will get to that. Cool. So yeah, move on. So the point is like just kind of why separate, right? Like, you know, you can have like one application. Why do we need this multiple? What's the point? So it's kind of goes a bigger topic of just kind of I throw like a different words to you so you can kind of hear it and maybe remember it for next time. But it's a very big topic and it's very important. But the idea is it comes from the like domain-driven design. It's like the way you design your application is to represent the real world and try to slice it in kind of different chunks, right? So for example, in this example, we're just taken from internet. So you have this like sales context and support context. And this kind of like different use cases in the real world, how you deal with your application. So under the hood, you will have actually two separate applications which kind of deal with different use cases. And that's why you kind of, in like our example, that will be two Rails engines, right? Because they part of the same application, but they have completely different use cases and have kind of different goals in a way. But yeah, you can read about like in this kind of this circle, like one circle bubble is called like bounded context. It's again, it's like this within the circle, everything kind of relates, but it doesn't relate too much outside it, if that makes sense. So same, this kind of principle goes to more like foundation of the software development. You probably heard of high cohesion, low coupling, right? And this is like good example to like explain it. So ultimately, you can see on the picture, you have like two packages on the left and the right. And the idea, like our goal as a like, you know, software design, software development, we want to have those packages more like with high cohesion, right? So all of the classes within that package, they closely related to each other. And then we have a second package, and they also closely relate to each other. But we want to minimize the dependencies across those packages. So pretty much you want to like tie up like high cohesion, so it means they're all related, like high cohesion here, and loose coupling, so it means they loosely coupled, right? So it's kind of, that's the idea, like it's tight, but also loose at the same time. And that's why it's called high cohesion loose coupling. And that's kind of the overall, this is like a principles of good software design. We want to package it, but also have very few links going out and in. And yeah, and it's like also just to add more like why like separation is also lowers the cognitive load, and cognitive load is more like all the things that you need to remember. When you have like one giant application, you kind of like, I need to remember all these 50 classes. But when you have like small one, oh, this is just like admin app. Like you only going to need to remember like 10 models that you're working with, right? Just kind of like it's easier to work with. Also, like different teams can just work on different applications that you don't need to like step on each other's toes because yeah, hey, this is just admin app, I'm working on the admin app. So ultimately it's like different applications, right? Factories are simple as well. So factories in tests, because you can put the factors within each application as well. So again, it's all kind of scoped within this application. Again, you're not thinking what is this user pose dash something model, right? Because it's kind of relates to completely different application. You're only working within that single context, right? And that's kind of the advantage. And also it's very important when you're testing something, because you know you don't want to test everything, right? There's gonna like stop some things, and ideally you want to stop those loosely coupled connection across packages, but you don't want to stop anything inside the package, right? So because you want to package one thing as a whole thing. So yeah, and that's why it just gives you clear understanding. It's like, hey, if you want to stub, just stub everything outside, but test everything inside. So, and one thing just kind of from my experience, so like I've had, more than 10 years of Rails experience, and only like this year, I pretty much like started using that approach. And interesting also like to observe how like my experience with it, and my experience is like having the structure has actually forced me to write better code, because when I create a new feature, like I forced to think like, where should it go? Like what application? Because normally I would just like throw it as like, don't care. But now it's just like, and I'm thinking more like I'm forced to think about like architecture upfront. It's like, and also as I'm designing, I was like, I had the case when I had this calendar feature, and then calendar settings were living on the user model. But user model was a completely different package, different engine. And I was like, and it kind of is a big like alert is like, why calendar settings live completely different package? Because calendar settings should live in the calendar package. And that's already like highlighted issues with this kind of design. That's already was very easy to pick up. Also, there are some choices that I've made to make my life easier. So kind of the way I develop or principle that I use is like optimize for the change, right? So even having a lot of software experience, there are a lot of things I get wrong all the time. So kind of the best thing is just like accept we're gonna get it wrong and just do everything right now what we can just to make it easier to change later, right? So that's kind of my principle that I use and I recommend for you as well. And because there's always trade-off, and yeah, to make it like easier to change later. So one thing I chose, actually, in each Rails application or like engine, what's the time? Just check the time, a couple of minutes. I specifically don't want to use single namespace for the engine, right? So even though there's like a, I don't know, like calendar application, which deals with all of the calendar things, I wouldn't nest it under the calendar namespace. It's still going to be under the root namespace, if that makes sense. And the reason for this, I've tried both approaches, and the reason, what I found, if I start nesting under namespaces, and quite often I'm gonna get it wrong, because what I think is right today, maybe in a month's time, is actually it's gonna change again. And then later it's like, oh, but now it's nested on the different namespaces, and then you start refactoring, and it's actually a lot of effort to refactor out of one namespace to another namespace. So pretty much I was like, I don't want to deal with any of that. I'm just gonna make everything like on the top level, because once it's on the top level, you just drag one file from one engine to another engine, and you're done. Like everything just works. So that's why it's just like, and I've done it already like multiple times. And it's just like, sometimes like I kind of structure the package or engine, and then I was like, yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense, kind of how it's just kind of responsibility is not very clear. And then I was like, okay, let's just split up. This goes here, this goes there. Again, like 5 minutes later, it's done. So that's why like just moving file around doesn't require you any like refactoring. So that's why like it's kind of worked very well for me. And another good advantage is just like it without namespaces, just using it just follows Rails naming convention. So when you have relationships across models, again, in this case, I have my model called Zom user. So then all of the relationships is just going to be called has one Zom user, right? So it's kind of, I don't need to specify, just like I'm just relying on this Rails convention, which is also like cleans up code like a lot. And another like big advantage that I found, I'll always call pretty much, when you have like local variables as well, let's use the user is very common, because you will have a lot of different users in the different contexts, right? Like in the calendar example, there will be like calendar user. In the posts or like chat engine, you will have like chat user, right? So, and then you have a lot of these different users that kind of have different responsibilities, right? But you don't want to call them user because it's confusing, like which user are you talking about? So that's why I just like, pick the convention, just it's always should be prefixed what type of user, right? So in this case, it's a Zom user model. So all of the variables, local variables will be called zom_user. It's very clear, like that's what the model is. Yeah, so that's kind of continues with that. So yeah, just like prefixing with like engine or something. So it's very clear which one it is. And also like optimizing for change, one thing which also helped. I use it's trying to figure out like what's the good name for it, but yeah, it's no model nesting. So pretty much flat class definitions. So for example, the first example is like it's all flat, right? The second one you can do like nested version. It's like it's the same, almost the same functionality wise, but I found like the second approach, the bottom approach, it just again makes it harder to refactor later, because sometimes you might refer to the classes like which are relative, and if you move it to different, it's just like it's one of those cases like, hey, if you want to refactor, there's actually could be more work than needed. But if you use the first approach, it's pretty much guaranteed it's gonna work if you just like move it to different place. So that's why just like it's more like I found it more reliable, it's more verbose, because every like reference of the class or module, it's guaranteed to work. So yeah, so definitely like one thing can recommend. So, and now I'm gonna get into the list of lessons as well, like what I've learned on the way as well. So one interesting thing, so biggest kind of lesson is like, don't leave any Ruby code in the app folder. And the reason is if you still kind of keep some application in the app folder and start splitting into these engines, like small applications, the main app folder will be like a dumping ground, right? If you don't know where to put it, you would just throw there. But if you, like I mentioned, if you don't have anything there, you're forced to think, hey, where should it go, right? So it's kind of actually forces you to structure application better without having this kind of dumping ground. So I would definitely recommend just like not to have it. And actually yeah, so I'll get to that. Yeah, so second lesson, yeah, you will get it wrong, design for change. I got it wrong multiple times. Even when I was super confident, it's just like, yep, that's easy. This is just a chat system. I know how to do it. And then, 1 month later, it's just like, nah, all the decision choices is like weren't correct, and I have to like redo it. And just amazing, like how often that happens, unfortunately. So yeah, it's the lean engines, and I call it lean engines. This is just like what I showed you, just like one file. It's very easy to get started and to transition to. So pretty much you can just take like existing Rails application, copy all of your models, folders, and just move them into the first engine, right? And call it like legacy engine. And that's already like everything is guaranteed to work as is. And then you slowly start breaking down this one engine into like more engines, right? But you're already like from day one, you're not gonna have any Ruby code in your app folder. So that's like, it's very like easy to get started. So with Rails engine, there are two ways how you can do it, and they're called full engines and mountable engines. So it's kind of slightly different how they work. So short story is use full engines, not mountable engines. Mountable engines, like they give you, there's like slides here. So in a way, like mountable engines is like they more designed for gems, right? Like when you want to ship something in a gem and kind of like other people to use it, and you want to avoid conflicts with other codes, right? So that's why you kind of like, it's better like isolation of that code. So this is kind of better design. But when you're doing just your business application, you don't need to worry about the conflicts because you're in control of everything. So it just kind of, this isolation adds more friction in development. So that's why just like you don't really need it for business applications, but it's very useful for gems. But again, you probably wouldn't do that. Does it make sense? Do we need? Yeah, cool. All right. So yeah, lesson 5, all Rails app larger than tiny will benefit from lean engines. So this is like, I was quite surprised how good that approach was, and I would recommend it pretty much for all Rails apps to follow it. And I call it like tiny. I mean, if you have like basic like hello world blog example, like you probably don't need it. But anything beyond just any simple like business application will do, I think it will benefit. And it's like already like working on like new Rails apps, and I was just like, I kind of want to start separating it like straight from the start, because it just will be like clean application. It's easier to work with. So, and it's just like, it's very easy to get started. So I would like, what I'm trying to say is like, don't think you need like big application to leverage that. It's very easy just to start with one and just like add more engines, because again, there's like very low friction to do that. So on the negative sides, not everything gonna work out of the box, and you will need to configure some of the things. Not much, but yeah, sometimes like it's yeah, because it's not really like convention, right? Like what I'm showing you, it kind of works very easily, but some gems kind of don't know that's the convention, or there's no convention. So some gems you just need to configure the paths. It's like, hey, look for models in this apps folder. Some is like aspect, you need to configure again, just like, hey, look for spec in these folders. Some previews, it's just like, it's probably like maybe like 10 lines of code for little things, just kind of just configure the paths. But yeah, it's like Ruby itself going to work out of the box, but maybe some other support features, like, yeah, you just need to like slightly tweak the paths. But yeah, just to be aware of that. So yeah, another lesson is like, better architecture is not free, and there are additional but small effort required. So one example I can give you, this is again like a lesson from kind of using that approach. Like example of the calendar configuration, right? So let's say we have calendar, and for each user have some preferences for each calendar, right? So we have like user, calendar preferences, and calendar models, right? Make sense? So normally I would just have user and a calendar, and user will have a column, something like calendar preferences, right? So I'm just gonna throw a column on the user, which kind of, it's not technically, it's not really good approach, like in like architecture wise. And the better approach will be to have user, you have calendar settings and calendar. So you pretty much, it's kind of better way to, you need one more model to kind of model it correctly. But because you have one more model, it kind of adds this extra, like little bit more complexity, because now you have extra model, right? So it's kind of, it's simpler to have just user and throw it on the user. Simpler, faster. It's worse, but yeah, so that's kind of the trade-offs that we are talking about. So that's why, like, yeah, if you want to do it correctly, there's like this extra effort, but I still think it's like much easier because it makes the other things easier, like later on. Yeah, and the last lesson, coding is fun again. This is like very interesting, because when you work even like on big applications, but because you're working on these smaller, tiny like Rails applications within it, you get this feeling of just like working on just like small Rails app, because because it doesn't matter how big the rest of the things are. You're just working on the small app, and you're just like super efficient. It's just like, you don't need to remember much. You're not distracted by all the other stuff. Everything like in one folder. It's just like, it's just such a pleasure just to work with code. So yeah, that was like very, yeah, unexpected for me. So there's one question that I'm still yet to kind of figure out for myself, is where to put code. Because for example, in this example, you have a, let's say, profile application, and let's say post, like blog posts application, right? And they kind of deal with different concerns, but you will have on the profile list of posts, right? And the question is where that logic, let's say, use a post controller, and where that controller should go. Should it go to profile app, or should it go to post app? Because it's kind of like in between. And I think like my answer is like, it can both to either, but it also depends on the other like architectural decisions. But I kind of want to find like the good clear convention. So it's just like, just rule of thumb. It's like, hey, if that's the case, it goes here. But I don't have it yet, but yeah, maybe I'll tell you once I have more experience. And for the future discussion, there is also the gem called backwork. So this is, if you go back to the scale, so pretty much what I showed you is this lean engines, second from the left. But if you want to even step closer, so that will be the third option, like lean engines plus backwork. So we can actually enforce those dependencies across engines. So we can say like, hey, this engine not allowed to use any models from other engines, right? So we can make it even stricter, because currently you don't have the backwork, each engine can call anything from other engines. So it's just like, even though the different folders, in Ruby, everything is global, so they just can call each other. But as your application gets bigger, you want to kind of start enforcing it. So it's like, hey, you're not allowed to talk to this engine unless you explicitly like tell us that you want to talk to the engine. So that's what the backwork is for. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So some reference. So yeah, I mentioned the Julian's talk on YouTube. And yeah, thank you. So there are for discussions like, yeah, what your experience if you deal with it, any questions if you have for me, like with the Rails engines, working with nested modules or flat structure, dealing with multiple user models. If you kind of had that, what would we approach? Anything on domain-driven design, bounded context, dealing with the big applications, complexity, and backwork experience, like just anything. If you're kind of interested, share it, your experience, throw me questions. So it's kind of like open floor. Yes.
If you have a large project, so do you just separate the controllers, or everything with it goes to the engines?
All right. So the question is, if you have big application, to separate controllers, or just the models, right?
So you have like different relations with many things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just got that, and you separate controllers onto the engines, but with controllers, like, do everything related to it goes to that engine, or?
Yep. So my recommended way that works for me, I move controllers, pretty much everything, like views, except migrations, and routes. Those two things I decided not to do it because I find it still very handy to have it in one place. But the cool thing, you can do whatever you want. I can move, let's say, controllers even like right now to the main app, and it's just gonna work like as is. Like I don't need to change anything, and that's kind of the beauty. But I did find it's just easier to have like everything like related to the same package, right? Like it's engine, views, controllers, everything in one place. Because generally when you work on certain feature, you kind of touching models, you're touching controllers, you're touching specs, you're touching views. So it's kind of like, this is like pretty much this, if you take like chart app, right? So everything when I work on the chart feature, I'm touching all of them. So it's kind of handy, just like I just opened this chart app folder, and this is pretty much what I'm working with. So that's what I found like quite handy.
So you said it's an empty class in lib.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you do all those connections between engines?
So yeah, that's the question is, it's just empty class in lib. Where do I do connections across engines? Yeah. So this is like because it's inherits from Rails engine. So this is like Rails understands it. So when it loads this file, it's kind of like, I know what to do. So all we need to do is just like require that file somewhere, and Rails kind of automatically knows what to do with that folder. So that's why like there is convention that it should be under the lib. So, and then it automatically like understands like, hey, this is the models folder, this is the view folder. So this is, again, this is a Rails convention. It just automatically follows it, right? So, and all of the like classes, let's say chat class, because it just loads that class in Ruby. So in Ruby, it's all global, right? So the chat class can talk to, I don't know, to calendar class out there, because there is no boundaries once it's loaded. And that's what backwork helps to kind of like to control who's calling who. But ultimately, when you're loading the Ruby application, it's like it's all global, like everybody knows about each other. Yeah.
Is it like just you're separating for your view, for your convenience, but inside it, you will just know where to go and stuff?
Yeah, so it's more structural separation for the developer more than application. Yes. Oh. Because yeah, in Ruby, you can't like easily isolate it completely. So that's why if you want to do isolated, you will use this mountable engines. So they give you more separation. You can use more modules. You can nest on the single module. That's the one I decided not to do. You can kind of like isolate it that way, if it makes sense. But obviously, it's kind of like think of that as a scale. The more you isolate, the harder it is to refactor later if you got it wrong, right? So that's why it's like if you're confident in your design and architecture and everything, it's like, yeah, you want to isolate it. So it's like concrete and solid. But if it's still changing, evolving, I found it like I want to keep on the other side is like I want to keep it flexible so it's easier to change. So you can kind of like multiple steps in between as well. Yeah. Yes.
I'm going to bumble through this question because I haven't fully thought about how I'm going to ask it, but I hope by the time I stop talking that I've asked the question. So I'm thinking about the sort of functional layers, the model, the controller, and those sorts of things in Anton's book log. So we're talking a lot about like the layers that are separated by the technical thing it does. Model at the bottom, then application services, and the presentation layer on top. Whereas this is more about like domain slices, like crossing in the other direction, where each domain slice has its own set of layers within. My question is, do you find these applications, these engines, being layered differently? Do you find you have some more like presentation applications, and then maybe some like multiple model or data level applications with a presentation application depending on those different model applications? Or does each application tend to be more of a bottom to top slice from presentation to the data layer?
Yeah, so the question is...
Good luck.
So with the engine, it's sliced vertically. It's like one full stack. But is there cases where it could be like vertically, but also horizontally at the same time? The answer is you can do whatever makes sense for your application. So currently I'm doing only vertical, but because it's application, its own package, right? So you can move, I would say you can have, let's say 3, which is just dealing with the like database and models, and have a 1 that actually depends on all 3, and that will be your presentation layer, right? So for example, API could be a good example. You can have one like application that just like exposes your API endpoints, like GraphQL or anything, but API obviously kind of needs different data, right? So you can have like, hey, this is API version 1 application, but it depends on all of the other like engines that's like, hey, this is the user, this is the calendar, this is the chart. So, and yeah, which also makes it very easy to version different APIs because, hey, this is just one application that deals with it. And if you want different version, you just like start another Rails application. So, and because they kind of very like separate, like it's very easy, like again, just to deal with it separately. But yeah, so that's why like it's think of that application like as a little package, right? And you can just like group it, depend on it, build this tree hierarchy like however you want. So it's pretty much up to you like what you want to do with it. So that's why it's pretty flexible. Yeah.
Makes sense. And I guess like have you found a situation where maybe you have like one application provides the shell, like from a presentation layer point of view, it's just the layout of the templates, and then other applications maybe just like even consistent partials. Like has that situation come up for you?
So I do have, let's say I'm using view components, which is like a partial, but I do put them where they belong. So in this case, let's say this is chat application. So there are these partials for the chat message, as new message and red badge. So this is like little, you can call it partials. But I'm trying to put it like where in the context where they belong. So it's again makes sense. Like, but there are some core stuff which has kind of everything that everybody else might need. So currently I have this like short link feature. If you have like long link, you want to make it shorter, right? So it's kind of like it's a global feature. It's like it could be its own application, but it's kind of like one thing. So I kind of like put it into the core application because it's kind of like everybody needs that core. It's like everybody depends on the core in a way. It's like it's the bottom layer. So that could be example is just like, but yeah, if later, that's the thing, like if later I need it, I can move it out. Yeah, but let's say one example, I have this front end, which is like try app. So this one is more like, it's kind of aggregate front end, which kind of depends on lots of other, right? So it's kind of like one need to think of that example of like profile. You have like profile, but in profile, you want to show your messages, you want to show your calendars, everything belongs to the profile. So in a way, will be like higher level application that depends on lots of other ones. And this one will have this front end for, let's say, calendar, but calendar logic will live in a different application, right? So it's going to be just like presentation layer here, but this is like the different app. So that's why like the, if you look at the controllers, so there's a calendar events controller, even though there is also like calendar app here, right? So that's why like this is just like just exposing this, I would say, view in this application, but actually the logic lives in the calendar, if that makes sense.
Are there any tools for avoiding like? Great answer, by the way. Thank you. Firing off the questions.
No, go for it.
Are there any tools for avoiding like circular dependencies between engines? Assuming that's something you do want to avoid.
So the question is, are there any tools to avoid circular dependencies? So backward.
Right.
So personally, like, I don't care too much because it's just like I'm working on that by myself and I'm loading everything anyway. But the question was like, yeah, can be loaded just one but not another? Let's say when you're running specs, you can actually start isolating, hey, I only want to run specs for this application, like single one. And you actually don't need to even touch and load other ones, right? So you can actually optimize the like boot time and like all your specs. So that's a lot of things you can do, but I'm losing the question.
Avoiding circular.
Yeah, and circular dependence, yeah. Yeah, and that's when you want to start like more separating. That's the circular dependencies becomes more important because you want to avoid them. And that's the back work gonna help you with that, because you pretty much ideally, yeah, you want this hierarchy of layers of different applications. So applications depends on other ones. But yeah, it requires much more discipline. What I found again when you're developing application, and currently, like I'm just too lazy to do with it. I'm just like I know I'm making mistakes in the architecture, like where the data lives or where dependency flows. But again, it's just like because it's extra effort, I just don't want to deal with it. So that's why I'm going to the point. Like, better architecture is not free because it does. If you want to do it correctly, you need to like some things are slightly harder, right? And I'm just like being lazy. I don't want to harder. I just want to quick in this case. But yeah.
Thanks. I'll stop hogging the questions.
Yes.
I know you have separated out like admin app, user app, chat app, kind of thing. But on a scale level, right? Let's say some of your admin code that will essentially gonna impact your user code, which you would like to see all the time uptime for the user side. How would you avoid that? Because I could see this is leading toward microservices, but at the same time it's not. So how can you avoid someone writes their own code, or someone writes a query that sucks up all the database memory, but that will also impact the other apps. So how can we, avoid that possibility?
Yeah. So the question is, how can we minimize the risk of one issue in one engine affecting other engine? So it's quite easy because it's a like Rails app, right? So you can actually spawn run two Rails apps like a microservice, right? And this is going to be your client facing. This is going to be your admin. They're going to be running the same thing, like they're going to be identical, right? But this application will be running your user side, and this will be admin. So in a way, they will be running same code, but different kind of controllers, if that makes sense. Or you can even, when you separate those dependencies, when you're loading the app, you can actually be explicit as like, hey, I want to load the app, but not the admin app. So pretty much it's actually very easy to do it even when you're loading in this application, application config. So currently I'm just loading all of them. But if you want to be very explicit, you just say like, hey, I want this and this and this engine, and don't even load the other one. So, and because it's not loaded, you completely like eliminate it.
But they could be an issue like, let's say user has a chat functionality which shows the admin name and stuff that's coming from admin app folder. But if you don't load up the admin app for user side for those, because you have separated out the models as well, right?
Yeah.
So they might need the model interaction. So how would that gonna happen?
Well, they shouldn't, because their dependency direction should be correct in that case. So in that case, in your example, chat app can't depend on the admin app, but admin app will depend on the chat app, right? So it's kind of all the dependencies flow one way. If they don't flow one way, then you have the circular dependency, and that's what, pretty much you need to eliminate that. So that's why when you're running your application, you need to load everything below pretty much all of the other dependencies, right? So everything, let's say chat app depends on the core app, so you must load the core app. Like you can't not load it because it depends on it. So that's why dependency, and I think there are open source gems and projects to actually visualize dependencies in those engines as well. I haven't looked, but I've seen them before, so you can actually just draw a diagram like how they all depend on each other, and you will see it. So
just out of curiosity, let's last question to me. When you have so many engines working together, which you are currently writing, and does it impact your boot up time for the application?
The question is, does it, when you have many engines, does it impact your boot up time? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Because it's still the same number of files that you're loading. So, and I know, so this is approach also, let's say the Shopify company that using Shopify, they're running one of the biggest Rails app in the world. And they also using the same approach, and the backwork, that's the one done by them. And I know they have, I think more than between 50 or 100 different engines. And so they never mentioned that being a problem. And again, with my experience, I don't see that being a problem, because it's Ruby, fast with just dealing different folders, because ultimately it's the same code, just in different folders. So
can you just open any of the model in any if you can?
Yeah. So let's see chat.
So did you come across any situation where you have conflicting namespaces, or is it chat underscore app, and then you have chat? Do you come across any you have different same classes with different name, different classes with same name, chat in this app as well and chat in different app as well?
Yeah, so that's why yes, and that's why my kind of go-to is don't have these generic classes. Let's say user is very generic, right? So let's say I have user in different, so in this case I have chat user, right, which is ultimately it's almost the same as a user with a little bit more data, but I don't call it a user within the chat. I call it chat user, right? So I explicitly prefix all of the models within the context where it makes sense. Just to give example, so I have this Zom app, and it also has the user, but in this case it's called Zom user. So that's why by calling the class with the prefix, the file name, it will be the same class. So pretty much they call different things, right? So because they call different things, it's very explicit. It's hey, this user is different to that user, even though it's kind of the same, but they still different. Kind of not to confuse, because I worked on the project or in the company where we had kind of similar different, not engines, but different modules. You have billing, invoicing, and they have same model name. You have invoice here, invoice here, invoice here, but they mean completely different things. And when you look at the model, okay, this is invoice model, but then you're well, we have 5 invoices in the system, which one it is. And this is such a pain for me just to figure out okay, this is invoice in the billing context, so it's it must be that invoice, invoice, I mean class. So that's why I found it very painful just to kind of when you look at the model and you have invoice.find, but then again, because it's not very clear what invoice model you're talking about. And that's why, again, that's why I avoid this kind of module nesting, because it's with flat structure. So if I'll give you example. So in this case, so if normally I would, if I'd use the module nesting, I can drop, let's say, this thing and just get path. But then I have to mentally figure out because it's within this engine, it relates to the local one. So it's again, that's why I always I use the full class name everywhere, and that's why it just guarantees like I know exactly what it is. The same with the like pretty much everything else. So again, you can see like zone player, it just tells you exactly what it is. So you don't need to assume anything, and just because you don't need to assume, there's less bugs. It's just like very clear. So pretty much, yeah, eliminate all the assumptions and bugs as a result. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's good. I have one question from one of our Zoom user.
Okay.
If you are setting up a greenfield Rails app, do you configure it up to use engines from scratch, or is that something you would do that down the track when you need it?
I would Rails new, build minimal functionality without configuration, like just standard Rails. But when it's gonna beyond that, I would call like tiny, right? When you already start having like maybe like more than 5 models and kind of like already more functionality, that's when I would consider moving to like engines. So not straight away, because like I mentioned, like there's still like a bit of like extra friction. But when you start building like, you know, business application, it's like, yeah, like, and ideally I want to put all of these configurations like maybe gem, which just does it automatically for you. So then it becomes like zero friction. You just like add this config gem, and it just knows how all of that works. Pretty much all of the things that I have to figure out myself, like, yeah, all this config paths. And in that case, I would just do it straight away, because it's built like zero friction. You just like add this config gem, and it just works. You need pretty much, you don't need to do anything. So in that case, yeah. So it's short answer. Currently, no, because of the configs. But if the configs could be automated, straight away, yes.
This is not a question, take this comment, but I want to violently agree with something you said about basically that often engines in separate gems that are mountable are too much isolation. So I'll agree with the example if I can wrap.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So I work on like Zendesk support monolith, and I'm at the moment in the middle of projects to upgrade the Redis gem from Redis V4 to Redis RB V5, and that's everything you can imagine in terms of fun. And I think at the same time we're adding like connection pooling in Redis, for didn't have connection pooling before. There is a part of Zendesk that deals with the product formerly known as Twitter, called Zendesk channels. And for some reason, someone, when they first built Twitter functionality in Zendesk, decided that it would be good to put it in a separate gem, in a separate GitHub repo, with its own routes file that mounts all of its own paths. And it has been absolutely hell to do cross-cutting changes where it's like, all right, I want to change the way some fundamental infrastructure inside Monolith works, because yeah, we're going to go and like change Redis to use connection pooling and like find all the call sites in Classic that are using Redis and say, all right, I need to check out a connection for connection pooling. But then we also have to go and do that in channels gem, which we can do, and it would work in production, but what won't work is in its own isolated tests, because the tests that run in the channels gem don't have access to any of like the infrastructure, the test infrastructure in Monolith, because this is why I asked that question about you boot all the apps, so you just boot one app. And because channels is its own GitHub repo, its tests only boot channels, which means it has no access to like any of the shared infrastructure inside the main monolith to handle things like all the Redis connection pooling, for example. So it becomes like, I guess in an ideal world, like if you had a mountable engine, Redis would need to be configured as part of its arguments, right? It's like, all right, you know, mount Zendesk channels, and by the way, here's a list of 50,000 dependencies from Classic that you're going to need to run channels. But I mean, it doesn't. It just reaches in and grabs Redis out of the little namespace and it works. So I guess to wrap that setup up, yeah, mountable engines are too much, because if for a single application, it only makes sense if it's functionality you are distributing embedded in lots of other applications of the gem, because all of the infrastructure has to be configured into it.
Yep, and you also like mentioned another point, like the gem dependencies. So actually, okay, just on that, when you, because there's a Rails command to like, hey, I want to start new engine, and it actually gives you a lot of boilerplate. And I recommend not to use it. And that's part of the Julian's talk. He explains why and how. It actually gives you too much infrastructure. Because normally, if you do it again properly, correctly, each application will have its own gem file, right? And then you have this hierarchy of gem files. Again, you can do that. That's a proper way of doing it, but it's adds so much friction to development. So that's why, again, like that's why there's this kind of this spectrum that I like. That's that Julian suggested is like, hey, this is the lean engines. This is just like one file, everything works. But if you go on this Rails engines local or published, so this is like a full-blown version. This is
It's only if it's on you to put in root gem, basically.
exactly, yeah. So that's when you need to deal with like a lot of pretty much its own gem, its own application that can run. It's just like isolated in a way. But it's a trade-off, right? Like it's more isolated, but there is more work, and it's like it's harder, like again, to change it to integrate with the main application. So that's why, like, I think this middle ground is the best for again business applications. It's kind of leveraging like both sides of being like flexible, but also good as like separation. Yeah.
So I think someone plans to spend their December taking Xena's channels, that engine, folding it into the classic code base, and making a new packwork component.
Yep.
It's like classic, and integrating with like the other components and moving it to the left and deleting the engine.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach, because yeah, like if there's no use case that you mentioned, that single gem depends.
Nobody else is going to implement Xena's Twitter ticket and
Yeah.
different applications.
Yeah, so and that's the downside, like pretty much of being all microservices, right? If you don't leverage that being in isolation, like if only one application uses it, like it shouldn't be separate, like just nudge it inside the application, because you have this all the trade-offs again you're making. Yeah, good point. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you. You answered my question.
Cool.
I reported it out.
Awesome. Right, Anton.
Oh, great talk. Yeah, blown awaited, and I really enjoyed it. I really like the concept of how you name classes, your own player. Yeah, easy, sure name things involved. And I think that's the direction that Rails should probably market more, and they should probably move towards. I use Backwork a bit. I haven't used engines, and I'm wondering why you recommend to start with lean engines instead of, because it's break and change, as you said. Why instead of starting with the Backwork, which is just a Robocop, like a winter. And as I understand, it's not a break and change. Or is it a break and change?
So lean engines is not a breaking change. You can just move your files, different folder, everything works. Like pretty much guaranteed that everything works.
Yeah. The point of using the engine over just using Packwork by itself is that the engine was the biggest like work to know about like all the auto load paths underneath the engine. Whereas if you had a folder that you told Packwork about that didn't make an engine, you also need to tell Rails, by the way, add these models, these parts to the auto load paths, and etc. Separately from models, etc.
I haven't used Backwork, so I can't speak exactly of like implementation, but I would assume to start separating into engines is the first step. It's kind of like, hey, this is like kind of putting in different piles. And once you have different piles, you put like Backwork to actually start enforcing. Is like, hey, these now the different piles, let's just treat them separately now. And kind of slowly make the piles more kind of clear. So they work together, The
engine's a shortcut for configuring all those parts, basically.
Yeah. Or think of engines like it's just folder structure, right? It's Rails treats it just like, well, you can put code in one folder, or you can put it into like 5 folders. Ultimately, it loads, everything works the same way. It's just more easier to work with and kind of conceptually treat it as like it's a different things, right? But ultimately, for Rails, it's the same thing.
I think this Backwork will face the same problems, but much different. But my next question would be, how do you deal with the migrations? You said that, if you have a DB, there's no way to isolate it. Ideally, I would love to kind of have migration separated, or kind of have some segregation of my DB. Is it possible?
So, cool thing, again, you can do it multiple ways. I'm suggesting or suggested I'm just keeping all of the migrations in single place, db migrate, again, for simplicity. But you can move exactly the same inside each engine and put it, like create db folder here, create migrate folder, and Rails, again, works out of the box. So you can just, whatever makes sense for you. I just prefer, again, like simplicity, so don't need to remember where different migrations files. It's just like one list. It's kind of, again, just like optimized for speed rather than like clear separation. Because I don't see much value of even separating migrations. It's like, well, it's still one database. So even though those different models live in different engines, it's still single database. So it's kind of having single list of migrations actually more beneficial because we know what changes needs to happen to database. So, but yeah, ultimately, but yeah, you can move it in, split it up, and it's, again, works out of the box. Nothing you need to do. Yep. Oh, so
Something else to go on that.
Oh, yeah, I guess the last question, like, I mean, I was wondering if your app is contaminated, even with JavaScript, you know, maybe more than one JavaScript framework. Any advice how to look at clean engine? Is there any caveat?
So JavaScript, so because there is such a variety of integrations of Rails with JavaScript, and it's changing. So I've decided the way I'm dealing with JavaScript of not dealing with JavaScript. So that's why you see my JavaScript is in the app folder, because I just haven't put the effort to moving it to different stuff. Is like, again, it's like there is more configuration, and I just don't want to deal with it. So pretty much I have, let's say, two applications that I need two different like entrance files, so application and zombie ESB. So that's why I just have like two entrance file. Apart from that, like controllers are still shared, like stimulus controllers. Yeah. So and the yeah, but it's ultimately I'm using ESBuild and SAS for the just node compilation. So I'm not using asset pipeline. And it's all just, I mean, you can do it like with the, what is the package? Package JSON. So yeah, just use your build commands, like build SAS. So pretty much you can just like configure the path. Like, again, it's not that complicated. It's just like needs a bit of effort, and I just don't want to deal with it. It's just like, yeah. But ideally, again, that gem, if you have there's like this engine gem, but ideally I'll release or publish. It just will deal with all of that again. So you don't need to know. It just like works. You just like drop your JavaScript and it just works again. Again, so it's more just like putting those configurations into the convention, right? That's it. Yep.
This I mean, no, that was next. That's the question. I was just curious. When you were talking about moving the database folder into individual applications.
Yep.
When you're using SQLite, I haven't used it one for else, but are the SQLite files in the DB folder? Anyone?
SQLite file, yes, but you can change it. But yeah, it is in debug folder. Yeah.
Could you have like an individual SQLite database?
You can if you want to, but it's more, I believe, because you have the way it's structured. You have the main Rails app, and then this is a main Rails app is like engine, but with a bit more stuff in it. So I would believe that the database kind of will belong to the main app. Like, I mean, you can have multiple databases in Rails, right? And you can just configure, hey, these models use this database, this model, this database, and you can configure different files for it. So you can do it without engines. You can just do it with multiple databases feature. But it's, yeah, you can do it, but it's not really part of the engines because yeah, engine is more like for the code, I believe. Yeah. Yep.
Did you find there was much duplication, like with user models, multiple user models? Validation.
I had a question in the page, like,
Yeah. So the question is there much duplication of code?
Yeah, of code in your models, particularly in the user models, because you've got a lot of.
Right. So the answer is no, because those user models have different concerns.
Yeah.
So let's say I have a good example like identity. So right. So this is more authentication user. So this is like the core user model. Yeah. So this is kind of this is like the main user model, let's call it. So that way you have this, the email, name, time zone. This is your core stuff.
That's where your validations are.
Yeah, well, validation for the this kind of core stuff.
Yeah.
When you, let's say, have the ZOM user, this model. So this model belongs to the user, right? So this is one-to-one relationship. So that's why, but this has additional stuff that's relevant only to the specific use case. So it doesn't have the name, doesn't have the time zone, it just takes it from other user. So that's why like it's all the users, they are connected. It's more like one-to-one connection, but it's more because that example that I explained, it's two users, they separate and they're dealing with different concerns. So that's why, and it's very clear. So you don't end up with one user model. It's like what in Rails we call it like a God model, where it has like 50 columns, and you're trying to figure out like who uses that column, who uses that column. So that's exactly, you don't have the problem here because you actually have 20 different users, and each one of them exactly holds the data it needs to hold. So yeah, and that's what I get. It's like having more models again. Technically harder to work with because now you have to like, loading single user and having everything super convenient. But again, there are all the consequences, right? But creating two user models is like a bit more effort. But now you have much cleaner code and it's easier to test because the cool thing, let's say, if I'm using testing this, let's say ZOM app, I don't need, technically, I don't care too much about the main user, because I have this kind of ZOM user that's all of the models should use this ZOM user like local copy, right? So that's why it's kind of like what we're talking, like all of them high cohesion, so they all related to each other, and we have like just single connection going to the main user. So I can just like stop that connection in test, and all of that, like I don't even need to worry about like what other user does, if that makes sense.
So if you find a validation that is universal, you will put that into the core.
But there is no shared validations. It's because they're different models.
Yeah.
So that's why like there is no code duplication. It's just code separation. Yeah. And
Essentially, you have like one model that just kind of acts as a mirror kind of gate face, like user.
yeah,
User
so
ends up like the main kind of gateway.
yeah, so you have like the main user, and then you have different contexts in a way. It's like what user are we talking about? Are we using talking about like it's just different use cases, different contexts, different applications, right? Because ultimately you can have like you can think of user is just ID, and then even like email is already, you can say like, oh, this is more like profile user, right? So it's depending how you like structure your application, you can like reason it different way.
How many of these objects do you have? Like the gateway is just one or two from
so not many, like user is the main one, because usually there are not many dependencies across applications, but the user is like foundation. Everything needs a user. So that's why it's in now like doing like more and more of them, I would start straight away. It's just like, hey, like if I'm starting new engine, I was like, okay, this one needs user straight away. I don't even know, maybe there's no use case for it yet, but I would already like already create a user, because it's just like, for example, I had this again calendar. So I had like calendar talk, relates directly to this global user. So there's no need to have this calendar user intermediary like model. But then I was like, I need to have some calendar preferences. Where to store it? I need this calendar user model now. So it's kind of like there's, even though I might not have a use case yet, I will still need a model, because that's kind of like, it's this kind of connection across two different like worlds in a way. So yeah, so pretty much user is like guaranteed, and the rest, I can't think of anything else. Like I think this user just like everything. Yeah, I can't copy. No, I don't have it. But yeah, I do have, let's say, it's a common dependency on the user. User has a like handle, like Instagram handle. So which is also like, it's a global kind of feature, social feature. So that's also like not dependency, but it's kind of like most applications know it's a thing. Yeah. Any more questions or thoughts or shares? Anything maybe from our the Zendesk? story.
You bother to work with it.
Yeah, I did that. So yeah, and the gem file as well. You can have separate gem files. That's I didn't mention the slides, but I'm just using single gem file across everything. Again, easy to work with. Don't need to deal with it. If you want it later on, you can extract and start managing different dependencies in each application. Especially if you start like optimizing the load time, optimizing the I want to load this one but not this one engine, and you kind of like minimize the again dependencies that you load. You can go all the way, but again, I recommend don't deal with it until you actually need it, because it really kills your productivity, and it only makes sense like in big teams, because that's when you're gonna like leverage it. Yeah.
Where we can find the code snippet,
Code snippets for.
was it free?
So have a look at the slides, the Julian talk that I mentioned, because he talks a lot about the same, not conventions, but how to set up the Rails engines. This one. It's on Ruby Australia YouTube channel. It's all you need is Rails engines, and yeah, and he explains it very well. It's a good talk. But ultimately, that's all you need to get started. Or even it could be simple. You could just like simply require and just have this loop to require all of them. Any more questions?
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.